Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Teresa Chan and I'm the Assistant Dean of Faculty Development. I would like to introduce two of my co-speakers today, Sarrah Lal and Ilana Baer. So you guys want to introduce yourselves? Maybe Sarrah can go first.
Sure, welcome everyone. So I'm Sarrah Lal. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine's Division of Education and Innovation. I work with a group called the Michael G. DeGroot Health Innovation, Commercialization, and Entrepreneurship Initiative to teach health innovation and entrepreneurship. And I also lead the program for faculty development's leadership and management team.
Excellent. Ilana?
Hi, I'm Ilana Baer. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Pathology and Molecular Medicine, and I'm also the director of the Learning Technologies Lab for this Continuing Professional Development Unit. And I teach in a variety of settings from face-to-face to online to blended environments, and I work with faculty to help them use technology in their education programs.
All right, so I hope everyone's doing well. This is, once again, Online Teaching 101. It's a session that's really designed to give you an overview of practical tips to help you succeed as we navigate this sudden shift from in-person to online education. There are significant differences between online and in-person teaching, not just for the learner experience, but also for educators. So we're trying to use this session to discuss these differences and break down the creation of an online learning environment into selecting your platform, designing the learning experience, and assessing the evolving learner needs. After we go through all of this, we want to engage you in a bit of a Zoom poll. So you'll see what a Zoom poll looks like, just to learn a little bit more about your learning needs. And then we'll have a Q&A session, hopefully for about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the presentation.
Throughout the session, if you have any questions, please use the chat function to enter your questions there, and we'll address them at the end.
Perfect, thank you. Now, who are we? Of course, we just introduced ourselves, but this is just a slide to put our pictures up and provide some speaking points for who we are and what we do. But we'll skip over that and we'll head right into it. So at a first glance, in-person and online education probably doesn't seem like it's going to be so different. However, in recent years, there has been some increasing awareness that engagement or the participation in various activities or behaviors that are required in a course actually plays a really critical role in student success for online learning. When it comes to what you might think that engagement is important for in-person education and online education, and that's absolutely true. But what we find is that learners in online environments typically require more motivation, more discipline, more self-direction, and even more time management compared to an in-person equivalent of that course. So the presence of multiple distractions, as you can imagine, in their immediate environment, so the fact that they're not in the classroom, and a lot of lack of direct peer-to-peer contact can pose some challenges for engaging in educational content in the same way. Learners are also very much in need of being clear on expectations that are placed on them in the courses. So they need to be briefed on things like how often they need to post, how often is new content being uploaded, and they also must now rely on a lot of asynchronous nonverbal communication with both educators and their peers. So while they are probably used to doing this to an extent on a daily basis already, now the complete reliance on asynchronous nonverbal communication can pose a little bit of a challenge to the relationships that they build. Yeah, it is also worth considering that a lot of quiet students do find it easier to engage in an online format. So the playing field is a bit more level when it comes to online discussions. However, overwhelmingly, students in general feel like they need to be much more frequently active in online education in order to engage because of the asynchronous fashion and everyone contributing at different time points. Now, for educators, the role is really much more shifted into facilitation. So in an online forum, the content is readily available, so they are not dependent on you as heavily for communicating knowledge. And so in these online formats, you can imagine that learners can actually engage with content again and again until they understand the key takeaways. So the learning experience is now something that needs to be navigated. And for educators, they will be the ones who are the navigators for the learners. And especially given that the learners engage at different times in the day, it's really not uncommon now for the educators to receive communications at a lot of different times in the day. And many educators do feel that this is a little overwhelming. However, they also indicate that setting boundaries for when communications could be expected is quite useful. And we encourage you to do so as well, just so that learners are a bit clearer on when they can anticipate to receive support from the educators and from their peers. Many educators can also take this time to better understand how their learners are actually engaging with content. So Teresa and Ilana are going to go on and touch on this a little bit more in the next slides. But just a quick tip here is that a lot of learning management platforms actually give you the ability to see which content learners are engaging with. And when combined with learner assessments at various checkpoints, this can actually give you a great indication of how effective the content that you're delivering is for providing relevant information. Now, when it comes to designing in-person and online educational experiences, it's really important for you to understand that different forms of education actually yield different retention of information. And you probably already knew that. So that's not very surprising, but in essence, more interactive elements of teaching will yield higher retention of information. So however many times these elements are provided, it's actually a little bit more difficult to transfer those more engaging elements of teaching into an online teaching format because there's a lot more dependence on peer-to-peer interactions. So for example, in-class discussions may be reformatted to become social media dialogues, or they can take place in an online discussion board. Guest speakers can relay information through a webinar format, et cetera, et cetera. So you can imagine very easily how those formats can be translated from in-person to online. However, as you kind of think about how those different forms of teaching would be translated, it's useful to ask yourself a few different questions. So one question that you could ask yourself is, how often do you think, given the complexity of the information that's being provided in the course, how often do they actually need to check in on their own learning? So oftentimes what you could do is get some self-assessments, get some peer assessments, some instructor evaluations much more frequently so that the students actually understand how they're doing, and just optimize the number of checkpoints so that the learners have a good feel for how things are going on their end. Another question to ask yourself is, how large can a group actually be for productive interactions? Now, when it comes to in-person discussions, so in-class discussions, oftentimes you really benefit from having a few vocal learners, and then you get some good conversations going. However, when it comes to online formats, as I mentioned before, the playing field is much more level. And so what you find is that for those who are a little bit more quiet, they are now much more involved in discussions. And so perhaps smaller groups are much more effective for that format of education delivery.
One of the things that you can think about then when you're developing your online programming is how can you parse people out. And so we'll be going through different technologies you can use to create breakout rooms or other engagement strategies such as think, pair, share via digital means. And those can be ways that you can engage people. Because a lot of the time, Sarah's completely on the ball there. Introverts sometimes find it hard in person, and they actually flourish quite a bit online. So, and I think that's what you mean by the quiet people, right?
Exactly. Those who are a little less inclined to engage readily. And then the third question is exactly what Teresa said. So how can you use technology to mimic or simulate the activities that are beneficial to learning, but would be much easier to conduct in an in-person fashion? Now, when it comes to this presentation, again, it's intended to be an overview, but hopefully by the end of this, this presentation, you'll actually feel empowered and have a lot of ideas for how you can tackle some common challenges that online learning provides. So on this slide, you'll see a few of the key challenges that are often experienced. So for example, the challenge of adapting to an online learning format. This is new for everyone, not just for the educators, it's also new for the students. And so you will know how to respond to this by setting clear expectations, sending frequent reminders to tell them that this has to be completed by a certain date. And you'll also know that you need to be clear about the resources and supports that are available. If learners are disengaged, another very common thing that happens in online education, you'll know that you need to pique their interest through having a variety of different types of content, different activities, and perhaps even try to gamify the experiences for them. If learners are lacking a community, you'll know that you can engage them through actually creating synchronous interactions with smaller groups so they feel like they're part of a community. They feel like they know others who are in this educational environment with them. And so collaboration with others will create that social trust and contact that they need to feel more inclined, more motivated. And if learners, the last challenge being, if learners are getting insufficient feedback, you'll know that you actually can improve that by providing more feedback, increased frequency, and from a variety of sources, such as self-assessments, peer evaluation, and also instructor feedback, just to keep them motivated to keep going. Now, to help you with planning your activities, we've actually developed a bit of a toolkit. So it's a 4-piece online teaching toolkit, and it really emphasizes that there are 4 ingredients to consider when online teaching. So the first thing is a bit of a face-to-face meeting place. The second one is a digital corridor. The third piece is productivity tools, and the last piece is the social touch points. So the face-to-face meeting place is really just where synchronous communication can happen. The digital corridor is really just something that serves to connect where all these different technologies are. It connects people, it connects content, and it connects technologies. The productivity tools are really just designed to accelerate collaboration and accelerate learners being able to keep each other motivated. And also the social touch point is really just about enabling that trust and community building that the in-person interactions would usually provide in a normal classroom setting. Now I'm going to pass it up to Ilana, who's going to be focusing on the different platforms that are available for you to use.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. I really like the idea of the toolkit and the idea that we can think of how different tools can be used for different aspects of the course or whatever your teaching is going to involve. And I'm going to be looking at a broad host of tools, but also looking at some specific examples of how these tools could fit into the toolkit that Sarah was just sharing. Sarah, can you navigate to the next slide? Perfect, thanks. So on this screen is a whole host of tools, many of which are really the icons that are representing the tools that Sarah has put into the toolkit for us. And when I was really starting to think about which tools fit into which spot, for me, a lot of these tools can bridge over a number of these different aspects of the toolkit. And so many of us might be experienced with using Zoom and WebEx meetings, and those are really great for that face-to-face communication. But some of the tools like Microsoft Teams seem to bridge across the areas of the toolkit, because not only can we use it for a digital corridor, we can also use it for face-to-face or real-time communication. And we'll take a closer look at one of those examples. Some of you may be familiar with MedPortal as the learning management system for the School of Medicine. On Central Campus, we primarily use Avenue to Learn as our learning management system, but you'll also see a number of different tools here that we use for collaboration and productivity, such as the Google Suite, Office 365. And I think one of the things that's important to note when I look at the toolkit is that there's lots of different tools, and McMaster University definitely promotes use of some tools by having institutional licenses for those tools. And following the presentation session today, I'm going to be compiling a list of the different tools with their links to how you can get access to accounts for these different tools, as well as a comparison of some of the features and functionalities of these tools to help you in your decision making for when you might want to use them. So if we go on to the next slide, Sarah. Great, thank you. So some of the key considerations for how do you decide what tools you want to use. And so as a starting point, I always come back to what is the pedagogical reason you're using these tools when we're thinking about online teaching. And so what are the objectives or the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? And when we can look at that, that sometimes will help us determine what might be the best tool. Are we looking at an activity where we want students to be working together? Are we looking at a space in which we want the instructor and students to be connecting together? And what are the outcomes that we want students to be able to achieve as a result of that? And when we look at the objectives and the outcomes, that can help us make some decisions around the type of tool that is going to best be able to help ourselves and our students meet those needs.
Ilana, Ilana, I was going to say one of the things that you brought up that I'd like to accentuate is just really thinking about mapping the purpose to the tool. And I think that that's a brilliant point. I just wanted to really call that out because I think that that requires a little bit of highlighting and starring. And so this kind of putting that commentary in just so that we can stay on top of that. Because I think a lot of the time we're kind of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole sometimes. And what we can do is really map that purpose to the modality. And I think that that's a really important thing. I think one of the things that you also have taught me that you don't need to shy away from having multiple modalities. Just don't probably put them all in at once, kind of get people to get used to one and then move another one in and things like that. So I think that you've been very good at coaching people through that.
Yeah, and so that scaled approach, and you know, again, it always comes back, as much as I love technology, it comes back to what is it that I want to do from a teaching perspective. And I really use that as my kind of my guiding post for the decisions that I make. There are times where I think using a web conferencing tool may be the way to go. But then when I look at what I want students to be able to do, that actually may not be the best tool to meet the needs. And we can certainly, through PFD and CPD, help you to work through some of your own teaching scenarios as you move forward with your online teaching or other teaching that may be involving technology. Another key consideration is around the difficulty of the level of engagement. So is this a simple activity that you're wanting learners to be involved in, or is it complex? And one of the reasons this is important for consideration is that if it is something that is more complex, you might be marrying a couple of different technologies together. You might have an introduction to the activity using an online session like we're having right now to be able to explain the activity. But then you might be having another tool that the learners then go off and collaborate to achieve that activity. If it is something simple through written instructions, perhaps that could get posted in the learning management system, that might be something that learners can take on themselves. Another is the duration of the activity. Is it for 5 minutes, an hour? Is it going to be over an entire lecture? Is it going to occur before the lecture as a pre-work assignment, for example, in the flipped classroom model? So thinking about how long you want them to engage for. One of the moves that's happening, especially now as we've moved to this emergency remote learning, as I like to call it, is that particularly in the elementary school system, they're having sometimes students be online for 3 hours straight. And thinking about whether or not your learners actually be online for an extended period of time like that. And if they are going to be online for that long, how are you going to engage them in that process so that they stay engaged for that duration? Another one would be the type of engagement. So is this going to be a synchronous engagement? Is this going to be asynchronous? And by that, I mean, is this going to occur in real time, or is this going to occur on your own time that might be self-paced? So thinking about when the type of engagement is happening in addition to the duration of it. Another one is the organization of collaboration. What level of collaboration are you expecting from your learners with regards to the objectives or the outcomes? So one of the great things about some of these different tools, and we won't experience it today, but we could certainly run a session on Zoom specifically or other tools to show you the use of breakout rooms, where if we have a large group of learners, we could separate them into multiple rooms within the conference setting, and they can work on an individual or small group activity and then come back together as a group. And the last sort of key point I've put in here for consideration is the technical knowledge and support that's available. Some of these tools are easier to use than others. Some require a bit of a learning curve, not just for the educator, but for the students as well, and looking at what supports are available. One of the things to keep in mind is because we have institutional licenses for some of these tools on campus, it means we also have the technical support for these tools. So our teams through McPherson Institute and the University of Technology Services are experts in using some of these tools like Avenue to Learn, looking at Microsoft Teams as another example. And so there's a lot of support that we have internally at the institution. Can we go to the next slide? So these are certainly not an exhaustive list of benefits and challenges, but some of the key ones that come to mind when I think about some of the different tools that we could be using as part of our toolkit. Some of the benefits are that we can communicate, and we might be able to communicate through the use of video and audio as we're doing now. And I see that there are some people who have contributed to the chat tool, which we're going to be addressing those questions towards the end. And so the idea that we can communicate in multiple formats, and where this can be particularly useful, the fact that we have multiple formats, is that learners may be in a setting where maybe they aren't able to connect with audio with their microphones at that particular time, but they can still participate in the session by chatting through the chat messenger. We can collaborate through content sharing. So the example here is that Sarrah is sharing her slide set with us to guide us through the session today. And we could take it a step further by actually doing some real-time annotation on our slides. So a number of tools allow you to mark up your slides. So we could add stars perhaps beside some key benefits that we really like. And we could then save those files that have been annotated and send them out to the group for later review. Another aspect is engagement. I've mentioned breakout rooms just previously, but polling is another example where you can assess where your learners are at and what their knowledge is. And Sarrah will be taking us through some example polling questions towards the end. And you can also add on reactions. So you can like a comment or suggestion. And that also gives a heads up to others who have participated in the chat that they've read your comment. You can record the session, which we're doing today. And I added in the institutional licenses because I think that's an important benefit that we have at the university, is that the free version of many of these tools come with a lot of limitations. They might come with limitations in terms of time or the number of people that you can reach or the number of sessions. So to give you an example with Zoom, if you have a free account, you're limited to a 40-minute session. With the McMaster account, you are not limited in time, which means you can hold a very long or longer session. Some of the challenges that really come up around using these tools is that there can be technical difficulties. Sometimes it fails. One of the most common ones we're running into issues with right now is with bandwidth. With the number of people that are online, particularly in one person's household, there can be a lot of bandwidth that's taken up. If you have other family members who are engaged also on video calls or Netflix streaming is happening, that can be an issue. So one of the recommendations we often do with tools like Zoom is we ask you to turn off your video while we're in the session unless you're actively participating at that moment. The fact that we have a lot of tools at our disposal means there can be a learning curve for looking at some of the different features and functions within a tool, as well as how do we use the different tools and how can we use them together. Cost can be sometimes prohibitive depending on the cost of a particular software, but many of these do have some free options, so you can try them out even just with a free license. And privacy and security have been especially dominant issues in the media lately. I know a number of you might have already heard about the Zoom bombing that happens when people are coming into meetings and creating disruption through either comments or taking over the screen during the sessions. And so that certainly can be an issue when we look at some of the challenges. Sarrah, can you go to the next one? So I wanted to use our toolkit as an example, use the toolkit as our framework to look through a couple of different examples of how these different tools are being used. So this is an example of using Zoom for the primary meeting place. And in this screenshot, we can see that we've got video feeds of 4 different individuals. We can see that there's a chat function along the right-hand side on the screen where we can ask questions and interact. And so this is just giving you an example of what we're already involved in right now, but just seeing it from a screenshot view. One of the things you've probably already noticed is that you have capabilities of sharing video, you have capabilities of audio and the chat. You have the ability also to share your screen. And what's really nice about this feature is that if I wanted to share something that was on my screen, I can request control, and so I can do a screen share on my part. So there can be collaboration back and forth between the different screens that are being shared. As I mentioned before, we're recording this session, and that's certainly something that you can do in this one as well. Can we go to the next example? So this is an example I've taken for the digital quarter. The idea of having sort of this landing place or meeting place where different communications can happen. And the power of this is to have those communications that can occur both synchronously and asynchronously and occur in a place where sort of is almost like, I think, of a home base for students. And so this example was drawn from Microsoft Teams, and to illustrate how this is being used, one of the teams that we've created, I teach in the undergraduate anatomy program at McMaster. And as we've had to move our online anatomy course, online, we were looking at ways in which we could continue to support our students through our TAs. And so the TAs have moved what were previously in-person office hours to an online office setting. And we're using Microsoft Teams as the home base. So their digital corridor to interact with the students. And so what we have done within our team is that we have set up separate channels for every TA, and the TAs have posted a schedule with when they are going on the topics that they will be covering in their tutorial session. And the students, we asked them to join the Microsoft team through a digital code, and so they were able to self-enroll within the team. And then according to the schedule, they can click on the channel for the virtual office, and there will be a link that they can click join to join the live meeting. Those meetings can also be recorded and viewed later by students. But one of the other nice features that really takes it into that asynchronous component is that you have the ability to have a chat with your TAs in this setting, and that's what's illustrated here on the screen. And so students are able to share multimedia with the TAs to be able to get a little bit more information and clarify what their question is. And so we have an anatomy bell ringer exam coming up on Friday, and students are sharing pictures from the anatomy course, asking their TAs for help and guidance around those particular images. And then the TAs and students can interact in an asynchronous manner through chat function. Can you move on to the next? So the last example I wanted to show, as it's in the framework, is the productivity example. And I've used here an example looking at sort of the suite of Google apps. And so in creating our session today, Sarah, Teresa, and I had worked using the Google Slide app, and we're able to collaboratively put together the session through the Google Slides. And so both as an educator preparing your own materials, these productivity apps can be very helpful, but it also is a great tool and space in which your students can work together to be able to collaborate on projects. We've used the Google Slides here, but there are Google Docs as well, or spreadsheets that can be used. And there's a whole host of different apps that can be used for collaboration. Sarah, can you move to the next one, please? Thanks. So the last part I wanted to think about in terms of this toolbox is that each of the examples I've shown you were used more or less in isolation, but we can actually bring platforms and tools together to facilitate what it is we want to do to help us meet those objectives and outcomes I was referring to earlier. And so what's captured on this screen is a screenshot from a WebEx interface. So WebEx is another web conferencing platform similar to using Zoom. And we also have a screenshot of Mentimeter, which is a tool that allows you to do polling type questions, short answer type questions. It's the way in which we can further engage our audience. So one of the things that we have done for the anatomy course is we have held town hall meetings for students to be able to ask a lot of questions. You can still ask questions in the chat window of one of the conferencing tools, but the reason we chose Mentimeter to be our support tool for this particular session is that students were able to log onto the Mentimeter questionnaire using their phones or other devices that they were using. They were able to submit their questions. In this case, they were short answer questions. And what they were able to do was upvote questions. So if a question got posted and they liked the question, they could click on it. And as the educator watching the polling questions that were coming up, I could see which questions were popular, and they were jumping to the top of the list, and they could be addressed. And then I could dismiss those questions once they had been answered. And so that was an additional functionality that currently isn't present in tools like WebEx or Zoom. So there are times when, based on what we want to do, it may be worthwhile to marry some of these platforms together for our sessions. Pass on to the next slide, please. And so as we move forward with online teaching and really just sort of giving you a touch of what is out there in terms of tools that can be used as part of your toolkit, and some examples of how we've been using some of these tools, there are lots of resources that are being put together and provided for you on the PFD website. One of them I've highlighted here is Allium's team's Teaching in the Age of the COVID-19 series, and a couple of posts around teaching with tech while social distancing, real-time video conferencing, and asynchronous chats. We're going to be holding more sessions as we move forward, and we'll be gauging some of your interest and where your needs are through Sarah's polling questions. I'll pass it on to you. Teresa?
Yeah, so I was just going to raise a point that if you're interested, you can check out more of the posts that we have online by going to MacPFD.ca. And so a lot of the resources that we've developed are there. Right, so next is the idea that we want to talk about designing a great learning experience for your students. And so let's talk about how we can optimize those experiences. In terms of keeping social in the social distancing kind of that we're doing right now, it really means that you have to think about how you can be social with your teachers. And so as a teacher, often before a session, for instance, you can actually do some mingling, you can actually have a little bit of chatting. And I think that a big part of what you can do is actually bring that right into the chat. So you can have a little bit of an orientation session, get people to introduce each other, get people to talk about things. And really think about how you can check in. So especially when it's so stressful and there's so many changes, it might just be about like the new format of the exam, or thinking about what's going to happen if you're coaching medical students on the next phases of their career because their electives have been canceled. And so you might want to give people room to actually have that discussion and correspondence. During the session, I think that it's important to have a shared canvas. And so you can actually have a separate Google Doc or a Google Slide where people can type down notes, or in Zoom, I like using that chat function as that ability to do that. Okay. Another thing that you can do is you can provide breaks, because as much as all of us like marathon sessions on Zoom right now, a big part of what we might notice is that if you're going from meeting to meeting to meeting, you yourself might be experiencing that you haven't had a chance to go to the bathroom or be able to actually interface with other people. And so a big part of what you can do is actually provide those breaks during the session, right? Another thing that you can do is think about how you can have nonverbal cues even if you're on mute. So thumbs up, or give a wave, or things like that, and smile when you're kind of not focusing on things too much, or turn off your camera so that people don't see you, furrowing your brow too much as they're talking, because that can be distracting. Next slide. And so what we want to do as an educator is think about how we can have those opportunities to get people to know you. So creating that space between sessions to be able to think about how we can disclose what's going on in our lives, share a little bit, create that space for people to feel psychologically safe to share in return. engaging in a digital corridor so that in between sessions you're reachable, because like again, they might not be able to run into you. For a lot of the distributed campuses, it might be something as simple as being able to create a way to connect with different people. If you're not all tutoring groups that are local to you anymore, you may want to create a Slack or a Microsoft Teams groups where people can hang out and exchange ideas in between. I think that having a combination of synchronous tools such as Zoom and then that other home base is really good, because even while you're actually synchronously doing this kind of work, you can actually in the back be back channeling, and people can be sending files to each other on the back end. So especially if you can imagine if you're running PBL, so that's problem-based learning for those of you not at McMaster, if you're tuning in, the idea is that you may find that it's important to actually make a list of the kind of things that you can share in between sessions or afterwards as well. So sometimes people find it hard to have multiple channels working at once. So you may just want to make a list on a piece of paper and then send the papers you were mentioning, things like that, onto a digital corridor later on. So Microsoft Teams has a good integration for that, but Slack can also be another place, or even just a follow-up email would be good as well. And I think that you can add some fun to all of this as well. So you can think about doing some icebreakers at the beginning of the session. You can also have check-ins later on around break times, things like that. So definitely think about all those things. Next slide, Sarah. And I think that this is a post that we featured on the MacPFD.ca site by Sean Park, who's one of the division mates in Sarah's division of education and innovation. And so he wrote a great blog post called Staying Human While Virtual. So you can give that a look later on, and you'll be able to kind of see what content he's encouraged there. But here's some take homes. I think that you can think about multiple ways to shift attention by having different ways that you can connect. You can also have some shared rituals to promote, human connection. So whether it's like everyone's bringing a cool meme that they saw, maybe it's that they want to exchange their favorite song, use those icebreakers to create that kind of human element to things. And then I think that you can also use up some warm-up activities. And I've actually on a Zoom like this got everyone to stand up and run on the spot for like 30 seconds, things like that. So I think that those are all things that you can do, even if we are in different rooms. It doesn't mean that you have to change your teaching too much. And think about all those different opportunities. Next slide. All right. And so I think this part is about learning and building. So how can you also think about your teaching effectiveness and improving? And so for me, I think that this is a huge part of any teacher's portfolio. It's just that I think in the online space, you have opportunity to change it up a little bit more with the diversity of tools. So just like you would if you're running a small group session over multiple weeks, 10, 12 weeks, you may also want to think about how you can actually engage people in continuous improvement. And so when we talk about evaluation, I guess colloquially we use that word when we're talking about evaluating students, but generally speaking in the medical education literature and health professions education literature and K-12 literature actually, in education, evaluation is usually of the program of the teaching. So of you as the system rather than of the students themselves. And so for students or trainees, the word that we use there is usually assessment. And so evaluation basics would are really just to remind you that you are, as a frontline teacher, able to gather information. You don't have to wait for the end of rotation evaluation of your course in order to improve. You could do some continuous quality improvement all the way along. And so at the end of each session, what I like to do to fold into my teams or to some of my online resources is that at the end of each session, I kind of ask everyone to think about what worked for them, what didn't work, and then maybe think about how you can improve for the next time so that you don't torture your students or your trainees with having to go through the same thing over and over again and they all hated it. So having a continuous quality improvement mindset or a CQI mindset, I think can really improve your digital experience over a couple of weeks. I think this actually works really well for digital and group meetings as well. So thinking about what could work, what could change, and how people's experiences might be that they might have a good suggestion for how to overcome the challenges they've experienced. All right. So I guess we have those 4 elements, and I'm going to hand it back to Sarah now to kind of sum us up.
Okay, just going to unmute myself. So hopefully throughout the presentation, you learned a little bit a little bit. This is not supposed to be the most thorough presentation about every single element here, but you learned a little bit about face-to-face meeting places or primary meeting places, the different types of digital corridors that you can set up, the productivity tools that you can employ to help folks actually do the activities that you're expecting them to do, and the types of social touch points that really need to be considered, because it's, again, as an educator in an online environment, it's quite a different setting, and those kind of peer-to-peer and peer instructor connections really take place in very different ways. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of all these different aspects, and I hope that the toolkit is going to be helpful in helping to frame your thinking about how to design these sorts of experiences to maximize learning and also enhance long-term information retention.